Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narwhal's Wildfire Forum. My name's Drew Anderson. I'm the Prairies reporter for the Narwhal, and I'd like to thank you all for being here. We're going to take it a little slow at the beginning here, just so that we can let people stream in. We've had multiple hundreds of people RSVP to this event, so it might take a little while for everybody to find their virtual seats. But before we get started, I'd like to say that the Narwhal is committed to upholding the principles of truth and reconciliation in our journalism. And I'm grateful to work from Calgary, where I'm based in Treaty 7 territory, the home of the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Blackfoot. We'd love to hear, as people are joining, where you're joining us from. I know there's people from all across Canada and maybe beyond that will be joining us. Let us know in the chat box where you are right now, and include the Indigenous nations that call that territory home if you feel comfortable doing so. Just a little bit about the Narwhal in case you aren't familiar with us. I know that these invites can go far and wide. We're a 5-year-old digital publication. We focus on in-depth and investigative journalism about the natural world in Canada. So I'm part of the expanded Prairies Bureau that covers Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. My responsibilities are Alberta and Saskatchewan, so it keeps me busy. And we also have teams based in Ontario and BC. BC is where the Narwhal got its start. We're a leader of nonprofit journalism in Canada. We're supported by more than 5,000 members now. And just want to say thank you to anybody that's in the audience that already is a member and supports our work. If you're not one already, you can check out the link in the chat to become one. Anyone who joins today will also get a copy of our beautiful and limited edition print publication. So this is our 2023 magazine. If you're already a member and you want to get your hands on a copy, send us a message and we'll direct you to get yours by making a small donation. Help support some of the work that we do. And just a little bit of bragging while we're all streaming into our reporting recently took home National Magazine Awards, Digital Publishing Awards, and Canadian Association of Journalists and Canadian Journalism Foundation Awards. So, we're very excited about being recognized for some of the work that we do. We love to do it. We'd love the support of people tuning in to help continue to do that. And our print edition features a lot of this award-winning work. So there's lots of incentives for you to sign up. Before we do get started, our panelists are here and waiting patiently, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. The session is being recorded, and it'll be available for viewing online after the event. So look out for an email tomorrow with a link to the video and the chat discussion. Only attendees will have access to the chat transcription. We're providing automated closed captioning for those who need a little bit of help following along. To turn it on, just go to your control panel at the bottom of the screen, all the way down there, and select the arrow next to the CC icon. So closed captioning icon there to turn it on. And it'll also allow you to select settings. So you can control the size of the captions if you need a little bit of a bigger font. And you can move the caption box anywhere around your screen if that helps you out. And finally, a big thank you to all those who submitted questions in advance. Like I said, we have hundreds of people that are interested in this event, and we got quite a few questions, about 150 of them already from attendees. And we're going to do our very best to get to as many of those as we can today. There will be people working in the background, some narwhals helping us out that are the bones of this operation, and they'll be trying to answer a lot of those questions in the Q&A. And then we're going to put some to our panelists as well. But we are short on time, so we won't get to everyone. So if you have questions, as we go along, please enter them in the Q&A box in the chat here. Not in the chat, sorry, in the Q&A box, and our team will do their best to answer some of those. And then we'll see how many of them we can get to the panelists. So I think we've probably given everybody enough time to sort of go in. So I don't see any reason why we should delay any further and just get this show on the road. I want to thank our panelists that are here today. We've got Amy Cardinal Christianson, we've got John Vaillant, and we've got Trina Moyles, all joining us today. Experts in their various categories when it comes to wildfires. And I just want to give the floor out to you, to the panelists, to sort of introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your work and sort of why you're here to discuss today. Amy, maybe we will start with you. A little rundown of who you are, and maybe tell us where you are right now too.
Sure. Yep. So I'm Amy. I'm a Métis woman. I'm from Treaty 8 territory. I currently live in Rocky Mountain House, and I'm an Indigenous fire specialist with Parks Canada. And I'm currently up at the Pasqua Fire Base. I'm helping out here as a liaison officer with the First Nations that are impacted by the fires that have happened here, both the Davidson Complex and the Pasqua fires. So yeah, I think I got into this area as an Indigenous person, just, really wanting to see more Indigenous people involved in fire and advocating in this area. And so, yeah, I'm happy to be here and answer any questions. Thanks, Drew.
Wonderful. Thanks for being here. Trina, let's go to you next.
Hello, my name is Trina Moyles. I'm currently in Whitehorse, Yukon, but I grew up in the Peace River country of northwestern Alberta, and I worked for Alberta Wildfire as a wildfire lookout observer for 7 years, from 2016, which was the year the Fort McMurray wildfire happened, and I worked right up until last season, so this was my first season not in the fire tower. I'm also a writer and journalist, and I wrote a book about my experiences as a wildfire lookout and sort of a commentary on wildfire ecology. And what it means to be, in this amazing thing that is wildfire response, which is a pretty incredible dynamic mechanism with very many moving pieces and really incredible people from all walks of life, which I was really proud to be a part of. And the book is called Lookout: Love, Solitude, and Searching for Wildfire in the Boreal. And I was really honored to be invited to be on this panel with both John and Amy, whose work I'm really in awe of, and happy to be here to provide a little bit of a perspective on the Frontline experience, which, as I was a frontline worker for 7 years, I think is really missing in the way that we talk about wildfire and what stories make it into the media. So I'm happy to be here to represent some of those viewpoints, because I'm in the position now that I can speak out and be a little bit louder about some of those experiences. So very happy to be here.
Well, thanks for being here. John, we'll end with you.
Hey, Drew and everybody. So good to be with you all. My name's John Vaillant. I'm based in Vancouver, and I'm a journalist and author. My latest book is called Fire Weather, and it really focuses on the Fort McMurray fire of 2016, but really as a way of trying to understand what I'm calling 21st century fire, which is a kind of wildfire that is impacting communities in ways that we really haven't seen so much in the past. And the more time I spent up in Fort McMurray talking to firefighters and talking to evacuees and people who stayed and tried to save their properties in 2016, I came to understand that the energy released in that fire was something that most humans on Earth have never seen before. And I came to understand more clearly that the people who experienced that and some other more recent 21st century fires are really messengers from the future. And it's really important that we listen to them, because those experiences that they've had, that they've endured, that they've managed to survive could be ours too. And it felt really important to me to try to convey that to the general public.
Wonderful. Well, and that's a good starting point for this conversation, this concept of a 21st century fire. And, there might be debate on this panel about that concept too, which could be fairly interesting, just sort of the unprecedented nature of these fires. When you're talking about a 21st century fire, I mean, specifically, what are you talking about? Are you talking about a fire that is hotter, bigger, badder in the woods in general? Are you talking about sort of that interface with civilization that we see, or with inhabited areas and infrastructure, or all of the above? I mean, what is a 21st century fire?
It's really a combination of those, Drew. And climate scientists really for decades have predicted that we would start to experience noticeable changes in temperature and all kinds of atmospheric behavior in the late 90s, early 2000s. That's when basically climate forcing, enhanced CO2 due to fossil fuel burning would emerge out of what's called, the noise of random weather fluctuation, climate fluctuation. And so around 2000, we start seeing an intensification of certain types of fire behavior and the impacts that has on not just forests, but on settlements. And some examples of that are fire tornadoes, which have occurred in Australia and now in California. And those were really unheard of prior to 2003. Likewise, the intensity of the burning that we saw in Slave Lake in 2011, that we saw in the Tubbs fire in California in 2017, that we saw in Fort McMurray in 2016, where the houses aren't simply burned down, they're completely erased from the landscape, and the only thing that's left is concrete and steel. And so that kind of total immolation is something relatively new. And so these would be, a couple of examples. And also there's the ferocity with which fires are coming out of the forest and into the built environment, really coming like a superheated tsunami of energy, pushing 500 Celsius radiant heat in front of it that desiccates everything and prepares everything for total combustion. And that's been a real shock for firefighters, both wildfire fighters and municipal firefighters, and not to mention really shocking for civilians.
Amy, is this something that you've seen through your work and through your knowledge and through speaking with elders? I mean, have you sort of seen a change in the kind of fires that we're experiencing in Canada and sort of the things that they bring with them?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, I think I go quite a bit further back as an Indigenous person to when, fire exclusion came basically with settlers that came here and put fire on our land. So I agree it's a climate change thing. I also think it's a forest management issue, and that, we've not allowed fire to take its natural course on the landship, that we've not upheld that responsibility to the land, and that now we're seeing the repercussions from that. So yeah, I think like John was saying, communities have been impacted by fire. Like in Canada, some, we had really big fires out in New Brunswick and other places that burnt settlements. But like that was back, when Canada was just being settled. But I think what we're seeing right now is just an increase in the number of events and the frequency that we're having them, and then also how they're across Canada. So before, we'd have evacuations in a lot of communities, but they would be concentrated kind of in one area, like in northern Saskatchewan or northeastern Ontario. But like what's really becoming unprecedented is that we're seeing it across Canada. And what that's really impacting is our ability as well to resource share, right? Because everyone's kind of experiencing big fires at once.
It is really interesting, I mean, I'm in media. Lots of people are sort of, looking around, feeling anxious and looking for easy answers, right? I mean, or just one thing, it is climate change, it is hot weather, it is lightning, it is, I mean, arson, but we won't really get into that. It is looking for these easy answers, but it is things like forest management that dates back to settlers. It is climate change. It is this buildup of fuels. I mean, it is so many different things that have to sort of come together to create these conditions. Is that an accurate way to describe it?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. And especially for Northern Indigenous communities, they've been talking about climate change for 40, 50 years, just the impacts that they were seeing in their territory slowly, but they're really ramping up now. So all the communities I work with talk a lot about how they're seeing these impacts and changes in the forest. And then, like John said, it sets us up for some big fire events.
Trina, I'd like to get to sort of, the reaction of Frontline people and how they're sort of dealing with this, but I'd also like to maybe address that question first off. I mean, you were up in the towers, you were on the front lines, you were dealing with people that were fighting these fires. I mean, what is the view from the front lines in terms of the severity and the nature of these fires, especially compared to, historical fires that have happened before?
I think there's a long historic record of wildfire. Wildfire, of course, is also a natural part of the boreal forest. There's a line from a really great book that I recommend called The Chinchaga Firestorm, by Cordy Timstra, which is about the Chinchaga Firestorm, which is the largest wildfire in Alberta's history, which happened in 1950 and burnt over the area in northwestern Alberta, which is where I worked as a wildfire lookout. And knowing the history of that really humbled me, and knowing that wildfire is certainly part of the boreal. The types of fires that we are seeing today, of course, as both John and Amy are talking about, are far more severe and things that are surprising frontline workers, certainly, and is being documented. But that 1950s fire does ground me in remembering there were communities warding off that fire with everything they had. And Keg River was one of those communities, which my fire tower is very close to that community, a Métis community in northwestern Alberta. And, there's documented record of that community fighting off that fire with everything they had, and also of a very disenchanted wildfire ranger who kept calling for support from Edmonton for resources to try and contain that fire when it was still manageable on the border of Alberta and BC. And, he was so disgruntled at the end of that fire season that he burnt all his records on it. And this is all, again, in Cordy's book. He burnt all his records on it, and he quit shortly thereafter. And I sort of think of my friends on the front lines this year too. And there was a lot of warning going into this fire season from frontline workers of, it's just a matter of time before another really bad fire season hits Alberta. And yet we've seen significant cutbacks in Alberta wildfire resources over the last decade. And so there's certainly, and there's, Slave Lake in 2011, Fort McMurray in 2016, lesser known fires in 2019, the Chuck Egg Complex and the McMillan Complex. And the Chuck Egg Complex burnt over 19 structures in Paddle Prairie, and that barely made the media. So from a frontline perspective, the focus on unprecedented is a little bit frustrating, because there's a very clear precedent that these wildfires are getting increasingly, the fire behavior is increasingly erratic, and we will be continued to be surprised by wildfire. So it's been a little bit frustrating, considering the enormous cutbacks and the ability to respond to these fires as fast as we can.
And for those of you on this discussion that haven't read it, Trina wrote an excellent article for the Narwhal just about some of the cutbacks that have happened in Alberta under the UCP government for firefighting. And I just want to probe that a little bit. I mean, what has happened to the front lines? We can talk about cuts, but I mean, what is actually going on with the front lines, and what are the consequences of some of those cuts? Can you get into that?
Yeah, the specifics which have not been getting media attention are really the shortening of contractual seasons of seasonal workers. So wildland firefighters in Alberta do not work year-round. They typically will work a 4 to 6 month contract. And despite the evidence from climate scientists saying, our fire seasons are going to start earlier and also burn later into the fall, we've seen significant cutbacks, upwards of 5 to 6 weeks off people's seasons. In August 2022, when things finally started to dry out and fire hazard was quite extreme, actually people were let go 4 weeks early. And then when fires started busting out, surprise, surprise, they were trying to, scramble to get people to come back to the front lines of wildfire. So it's really a little bit disparaging. What came out of Slave Lake in 2011 was the Flat Top Complex review in 2012, and that laid out excellent recommendations of hiring more wildland firefighters, rangers, the creation of unit crews, which are 20-person crews to work on to do sustained action on larger wildfires. These are all excellent things that came out of that fire season. I would be very surprised if after this fire season, those same recommendations aren't also offered. But I mean, kind of sad that that happened in 2011. And, we haven't learned from history, very recent history, clearly.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about, the problems, the cutbacks, the nature of these fires. Amy, a lot of your work has focused on sort of solutions and time-tested solutions that were used for generations in this country. And I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit. I mean, what are some of the things that we could do that maybe we aren't doing or aren't doing enough of, or you know, some of those lessons that we as a broader society have forgotten?
Yeah, sounds good. So I've been working quite a bit with a group called Indigenous Leadership Initiatives, and one of their goals is they basically support guardian programs in Canada. And one thing that we've been really looking at and trying to push is Indigenous fire guardian programs, where we have people year-round paid for by communities that can both do fire suppression when fires happen and fire response, but also do preparation work, do cultural burning, that type of stuff. And so we've seen success with that in Northern Australia and the Northern Territory there, where they have Indigenous fire ranger programs that have been great. And so Indigenous people across Canada used to use fire to achieve cultural objectives. But one of the side benefits of that was that by burning frequently and burning at times when it was low risk, you really reduce the amount of vegetation that's available to burn in like the hot months. So yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do. Is I'm really trying to work a lot in pushing for these groups where we can really have Indigenous people much more involved. Most of our Indigenous firefighters now are type 2 or only seasonal or contract firefighters, even though some of them have 30, 40, 50 years knowledge of fire. And so it's trying to, you know, how can we get that knowledge on the land, you know, to help us prepare for climate change and what's coming.
Mm. Well, and that is an interesting part of this conversation, is sort of the benefits of fire and the need for an ecosystem like the boreal forest to have fire, you know, for the seed pods to open, for the land to be cleared. You know, prescribed burning was something, or is something, I mean, it's still done, but it seems to have fallen out of favor. Is that fairly accurate? I mean, should we be doing more prescribed burning on the land? And I guess I'll throw that out to any of the panelists to answer.
I feel I really want to defer to Amy on this because she's working in it, and also to Trina. So that's why I am silent now.
Do either of you want to take that on, or should we move on to?
I mean, when I started in 2016, the Peace River country would do 2 very large controlled burns in the Peace River Valley. And my firefighting friends told me that was an excellent, and they would do these fires under the right conditions, of course, right? So like in the seasons where you still have snow on the ground, there's high moisture content, the temperatures are lower, there's no wind, like under very controlled circumstances to be burning. And my firefighter friends said that was an excellent place actually for them to get knowledge and experience on wildfires, which is critical in a wildfire response, because you can throw people on fire lines, but if they don't have any experience, you're actually creating like really unsafe circumstances and not the most efficient response, of course. Sort of you know, firefighting in itself is a little bit of like, you know, incredible, beautiful chaos. But I mean, experience really matters. And that's what makes this very dynamic system work, is very experienced people. So over, you know, I mean, I remember, I think it was before around one of the elections, you know, like the controlled burns that were supposed to happen got called off. So I mean, they're incredibly political, right? You know, I would advocate that and I think there's science, and Amy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but that they should be happening more and more under the right circumstances, because the forests need to burn. It's a great place for firefighters to get experience and in a safe way. And I was recently told by one that it's such a shame that they're not happening as much anymore, because it's a loss of a safe place where people can get that critical experience on the fire line.
So yeah, I just say yes. I don't know. We like so yeah, I mean, we need both. So agency prescribed fire and then Indigenous cultural fire would be my thing. I don't know how we can enter a future without that, and with, you know, doing and using good fire in good places on the land when it's a good time to burn. I think we just have to go back to what we were doing. And then too, when you're doing that type of work, then lightning can become more of your friend as well. And we're always going to have lightning fires. And so, yeah, it's just, I'm with Parks Canada, like we have a really great agency prescribed fire program. There's always risk with that, but it's also done a great job in achieving ecological objectives on the landscape too by returning fire.
Now, the good fire, I mean, doing those sort of controlled burns really can help, but obviously fire can be just as destructive. We're seeing that now. We've seen that in the past, and there's certainly been some, very sensational fires. I mean, John, your book dives right into some of the drama that sort of happened in Fort McMurray, this massive evacuation. And we see that sort of, the complexity and the sort of panic that settles in when you have, an urban center or a town sort of right there smack dab in the middle of the fire. I mean, how complicated is this when, fire meets town, and we have this, wildland-urban interface that you talk about? How difficult is it to sort of, get people safe, get out of the way of these big fires?
And so
We might be losing John here a little bit.
many remote communities, so many of these newer WUI communities, wildland-urban interface communities. Oh, really? Can you hear me?
You're back.
I'm back. Okay. In these WUI communities where 50% of Canadians make their homes, a lot of them have quite limited entrance and exit. And so you may only have one road in and out. And so to coordinate an evacuation of thousands, even from a place like Slave Lake that had 7,500, even that was a tricky operation. There were, more than 80,000 who were evacuated from Fort McMurray, again, on a single road. And if that road is blocked for any reason, you now have a fire trap, which can easily become a death trap. And I think what we don't appreciate is the almost miraculous escape that Fort McMurray citizens made in 2016. The fact that nobody was left behind, the fact that nobody died in the flames is an extraordinary circumstance, especially when you consider, frankly, how late the evacuation was called. And what I've noticed, a change since then is that my sense.
We've lost you again, I think. Of all the panelists, I thought John would hang in there the longest. I was betting on Amy, you being up there to sort of cut out first, but.
Yeah, let me know if you can hear me. Sorry about that.
No worries. I think it's fair to say that these are very complex operations when you have an urban center and that you need to deal with this. I mean, do you expect we'll see more of that?
If you can hear me again, I would say absolutely yes. And what's happening now, I feel like the evacuations are now more preemptive, more precautionary. And, what we don't see, what's not as visible, is the trauma that these late evacuations cause, that trying to escape through flames inflicts on a person and on the families that they're trying to protect. And so what you have in Fort McMurray to this day is a lot of PTSD. And that's, one of the silent and invisible damages inflicted by wildfire, by WUI fire. And preemptive evacuation can reduce that dramatically. So that's a big one. And that's one that, came up regularly in my interviews with folks from Fort McMurray and also elsewhere.
So we have these sort of, WUI fires, as you call them, where we have these urban centers and the forest up there, but it's certainly not just these dramatic events that happen. Those things make the news. We've got, pickup trucks stalled on the side of the road with, flames overlapping them. We've got entire neighborhoods burnt to the ground. These things make great pictures, they get sensational, but they're certainly not the only communities that are affected and haven't been for a very long time, especially Indigenous communities, where I think, Amy, you shared a stat where they are disproportionately affected by evacuations from wildfires. And I was hoping that we could talk about that a little bit. I mean, what are the impacts of fire on Indigenous communities as they're burning right
Sure. So I think our recent research with myself and Lynn Johnston and crew there, we're looking at wildfire evacuations from 1980 to 2021. And one of the big findings from that was even though Indigenous people only make up 5% of the Canadian population, and probably even less living in actual Indigenous communities, as we have lots of urban Indigenous people now, they make up 42% of the wildfire evacuation events that occur in Canada. So it's a huge disproportionate impact. And also when we look at duration of evacuations, smoke evacuations, they all, it's longer for Indigenous communities. There's many more smoke evacuations. I think it's like 50% of evacuations are from smoke, whereas for non-Indigenous people, they rarely get evacuated from smoke. And because of the locations, the lack of access, it's not a great situation when fires are occurring. And then communities have also been struggling to make decisions in their territory about trying to reduce their wildfire risk in those areas. So I think like when we combine that, like John said, it can have a long-term impact, and especially for these communities that, you know, after they return, there's also in Indigenous communities a lot of ecologic grief that occurs because the forest has basically been decimated around their communities. And we often hear, you know, fire is natural, we need it in the forest. But I'll say from an Indigenous perspective, this is not the type of fire that we need. It's generationally going to impact communities. And so the communities that I'm working with, you know, they're losing all their cultural territory. And so it's been very upsetting when they return. So, you know, you want to return to normal. How can you do that when everything that you know, relied on is gone? So, you know, not just a home, your territory. So I think there's been Indigenous groups that have really been strongly advocating, you know, for more of a role in Indigenous fire stewardship around their communities to reduce that risk.
and avoid that grief.
Mm.
You know, I mean, what are the Frontline saying about, like, you know, what do they say we need to do? Let's say, obviously reverse the cuts, but I mean, what do Frontline workers need to do their jobs? What are they saying that they need? Can you answer that question?
What's been interesting to me for this fire season is actually, I mean, and this is through social media, obviously, is that this fire season is really producing a lot of information and stories from the fire line, maybe from untraditional media sources or platforms on what it means to be a wildland firefighter. A wildland firefighter is different from a structural or municipal firefighter in that it is typically a very seasonal position. Like I said, 4 to 6 months. Lacking benefits, lacking access to pension. A lot of people work on the front lines, and you know, when they're working on the front lines, they may be working an 18-day shift, 14 to 16-hour days. If they're camping out on the fire line, there may be intense. It's really difficult working conditions. There's smoke inhalation. There's huge health hazards to the job and to the work that these people are doing, and very little sort of economic benefits and or sort of health safety benefits for them to endure that kind of work. And that's typically why people don't stay and do it for very long, or some do stay in the system for long. But there's a lot of information right now of firefighters advocating, and firefighter personnel, and not just firefighters, but when I say firefighters, I mean fire tower lookouts, I mean radio dispatchers, I mean people working in logistics. Like, it really is this multifaceted team to managing these large scale fires, and it's incredible people, you know. Yeah, the seasonal work and the shortening of contracts makes it really financially unfeasible for many people, which is where the retention issue really is. So a lot of folks are saying that this needs to be addressed, particularly in these, you know, if there's going to be multi-starts and multi-mega fires all at once where there's really no days off. Also, I think focusing on mental health as a result of these frontline workers on these fires is going to be something that we should be talking about in the future as well. And what are the supports, and are there supports in place for these frontline workers who are witnessing, you know, huge loss this season, and, you know, calling for resources and there's no resources, and what are the impact of that on frontline workers? I guess those are some of the key issues, I think.
And John, I'd be curious to sort of put that question to you as well. Through the research on your book, you spoke to a lot of people that were certainly, front and center fighting the fire in Fort McMurray. And Trina touched on sort of some of that complexity with having different groups working together to fight these things. I'm curious what your research sort of revealed to you about what frontline workers are thinking and how they want to see changes, if any, to the way that we're dealing with these kinds of fires.
Well, I mean, really resonating to everything that Amy and Trina are saying, first of all. But one of the things that I noticed that came up repeatedly was, first of all, when the fire enters the built environment, it's not really a forest fire anymore, but the forest is still on fire. And so how you coordinate municipal firefighters and then with wildland firefighters can be really tricky. I mean, there are different cultures, different equipment, different working style, different objectives even. And then you've got, urban union firefighters, and then you've got rural volunteer firefighters, and then you've got wildland firefighters. So you almost have three different cultures colliding on these wildland-urban interface fires. And so that's just is kind of creates a kind of culture clash, even though everybody is working really hard to work together. There still can be confusion and misinterpretation and just being overwhelmed because 100 houses on fire, nobody is really prepared for that. It really is overwhelming. And another factor here, and really a symptom of 21st century fire, is the fact that because it is now so warm, the nights are warmer, which means that fires, urban or wild, are actively spreading and growing at night. And they didn't used to do that so much. So firefighters would really, especially wildland firefighters, would often get a break. And Trina and Amy can speak more accurately to this, but that's been my understanding, is temperatures would drop, the fire would settle, it wouldn't go out, but it wouldn't grow actively, aggressively. And what we saw in Redding, California in 2018 and Fort McMurray in 2016 were fires that were growing aggressively, literally firestorm conditions happening in the middle of the night. And what that means is firefighters get no rest. So they go 12 hours, then they've pulled an all-nighter. But it's 6 a.m. and the fire's still going. So now they've got a whole nother day in front of them. Now they're up to 36 hours with no sleep and incredibly intense physical activity with the smoke, with the heat, with the disorientation, with often catastrophic loss right in front of their face, on their watch, so to speak. And so there were people, firefighters in Redding and in Fort McMurray, who hadn't slept in 2 days, maybe even 3 days. And that's super dangerous for handling heavy equipment. All kinds of things can happen. And again, another miracle, I hesitate to use that word, but it is amazing that no firefighters were seriously injured in Fort McMurray, given the incredible hours and the relentless pace that they were working at. And that's something that no one has really accounted for. And it's almost like you need 2 shifts or 3 shifts, and factories do that. Lots of the oil sands industry does that, but the firefighting industry doesn't do that. And so to get replacements in there and understanding, wow, this fire now is going to be growing all night. And then how do you fight it? And so, in California, they're starting to pilot infrared night vision firefighting for airplanes and helicopters. That's very, very recent. I think they're just starting that in Alberta now, but it's now a 24-hour project in a way that it wasn't so much previously. And so that creates a whole new host of problems that exacerbate the issues that Amy and Trina have just outlined.
Amy, I'm curious, when applying traditional knowledge to these sorts of problems, is there sort of a way to adapt to this changing situation that we can learn from that? I mean, we've talked about traditional burning. Are there other ways that traditional knowledge can be brought to bear to sort of adapt to these new kinds of fires? Or has traditional knowledge itself been forced to adapt to this sort of this new reality? How does that factor in?
You close.
Yeah, so I think Indigenous knowledge, one of the biggest things about it is that it's always adapted. So I mean, Indigenous knowledge adapted through colonization, which is probably one of the biggest impacts on, you know, nations ever. We survived through that. So I think with fire, with using Indigenous knowledge, that it really does provide nature-based solutions to climate change. And so I think, though, that the issue that we're seeing now is the opportunity to be able to use that. So there's just so many barriers for Indigenous people to be able to participate in fire. And so, yeah, I think that, like, obviously, not one thing I often hear is that the knowledge around fire and cultural fire has been lost. But I mean, really, nations have been burning, like, in secret, a lot of them, just not on the scale that they were before. And to me, that knowledge is still living and can be applied today. It would just be nice to, I think, for nations want to be able to have funding and resources so that they can train people, teach people to learn from elders. And there's a big fear, I think, right now of the appropriation of Indigenous knowledge around fire into agencies, where Indigenous people are once again completely left out of any decision making on their land. So there's that real distrust that still exists.
That's really interesting. And that sort of leads into a little bit of what we got coming in from the audience. I've been totally taking over this conversation because I could talk to all three of you all day and all night. But I will get to some of the questions from the audience. And I think one of the first ones might relate to that. You know, someone wrote in, how can Indigenous protected and conserved areas and nature-based solutions help? And how do we further these? You know, does anybody have an opinion on sort of the role of IPCAs in sort of dealing with fire seasons like the one that we're seeing right now?
Yep, I love the idea of IPCA, super supportive, as you can probably imagine. And I think that's something I'm working with Indigenous leadership initiatives on is, you know, how can we get fire guardian programs on lands like that, where it's Indigenous people that are involved year round on those territories to steward them.
Another question that come up, and this, you know, we wrote sort of an article on the Narwhal, sort of debunking article, looking at some of the conspiracy theories that were popping up. We felt it was important to sort of address some of those root causes. And one thing that we heard back a lot from when we were talking about sort of what really happens in a fire is that we sort of glossed over forest management. And certainly, Amy, you brought that up, and we've got an article out that went out Tuesday, an explainer sort of looking more at forest management practices and how those might contribute to fires. But maybe I'll put this to John first. Someone wanted to know what the key industrial forestry practices are that increase wildfire risk. And even, we'll just put in a bonus here. Again, if you don't know the answer, no need to answer it, but is glyphosate, the use of glyphosate herbicides, one of those practices that contributes to this? Oh, maybe we've lost John. Trina or Amy, do either of you want to take that one on? I'm not sure if you can answer that or not.
I mean, so I guess like fire is just basically about what's available to burn and when, right? So if you have lots of vegetation somewhere that's dry and it's, you know, a hot, dry day and you have an ignition source, something will burn. And so I think for like, you know, cut blocks, when they're leaving behind lots of slash and other things in the cut blocks that then dry out, those have potential to, you know, have fires that go through them. And when we're planting, you know, for monocultures, so like planting a lot of Douglas fir or pine or species that are prone to burn and spraying to reduce species that are less prone to burn, you have an increased fire risk as well. And that those stands then are much more prone to disturbance because they're all the same age. Yeah, so I think with Indigenous people, the idea is to have a mosaic on the landscape, like to have diversity, to have different stands, different types of plants, different types of trees that would break up fires that happen so that they can't roll across the landscape like we're seeing now.
And have you seen that, Trina, sort of in your experience watching these fires? Have you seen, I don't know if you've sort of, looked upon a monoculture forest versus a mixed wood forest and been able to see a difference? I mean, do you have personal experience witnessing that?
I would say, I mean, from the fire tower, each fire tower in Alberta is responsible for a 40-kilometer radius of forest around them. And I mean, you can see, I mean, some of the towers, the logging or clear cuts happen right up to the tower. You can also see the result of pine beetle infestation in the forest too, and like the result of monocrop and whatnot, has like led to an increase of like pine beetle infestation as well. And you can see that in the coloration of the tree. And those trees are known to be, I believe it's documented that they are more flammable, and so I guess that has increased like fire risk and intensity. And so you can witness some of those things from the tower, certainly.
I don't know if we've got John back here. John, are you with us?
Can you hear me?
Yes,
can you hear me? Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
I can wade in on this. Everything that Amy and Trina said, I really agree with. On top of that, what we're crossing right now are these invisible thresholds that are I think are really turning a forest we thought we knew into something else. And so a concrete example of that is on the day that Fort McMurray caught fire on May 3rd, 2016, the relative humidity was 11%, which is drier than a typical day in Death Valley in Southern California. And the temperature was 31 or 32 Celsius. And so those are basically Southern California temperatures in the Northern Boreal. And so it's the boreal forest, but with these extremely dry conditions and these extremely hot conditions, it allows fire to burn with an intensity that makes it blow through ordinary barriers. So where black spruce would typically explode into flame and burn with great vigor, as it typically does, and as it's designed to do, poplar and aspen have been noted, described as asbestos trees in the sense that they are damper, pulpier, more resistant to fire. But when you have Death Valley dry conditions and Southern California temperatures, not even the poplar or the aspen can slow the fire down. And the radiant heat coming off such a fire is so hot that it desiccates everything instantly and drives it up past combustion temperatures, so that when the fire actually hits it, it doesn't just catch on fire, it literally explodes into flame. And that's true for the houses too. And so the houses in Fort McMurray, some of the burn times were 5 minutes from a house with no fire on it to a burning basement. These are 2-story, $500,000 homes burning to the ground in 5 minutes. And that is new. And it's really hard to combat against that.
That's an interesting point to raise. We're hearing certainly a lot about fire smoke this season, particularly as it hits the larger centers out east that haven't typically been exposed to it during wildfire season. I'm based in Calgary. I'm sort of used to, there's going to be days where I keep my kids inside because it's smoky here. This is a new experience for those larger population centers. And so it's a topic of conversation this year. But you mentioned houses. What happens when, vinyl siding, wood that is, partially plastic and all the rest of it, cars, tires, all of it. I mean, how toxic are the fires in something from a Fort McMurray, a Slave Lake?
Drew, the firefighters who were on scene, particularly in Fort McMurray, that fire burned for weeks. Houses and work camps were burning down 2 weeks later. They were burning down on the 16th of May. You know, that's 2 weeks past May 3rd. And so, and there were firefighters who were on scene that whole time, inhaling burning houses and burning cars. And what we've discovered is a lot of the modern house is made of petroleum products or flammable chemicals. When you think of vinyl siding, tar shingles, vinyl windows, all the glues and laminates that go into plywood and chipboard, all the laminate flooring, all when you think of the synthetic petroleum-based stuffing for mattresses.
Lost you again, John, but we'll come back to that. Needless to say, a fairly toxic mix of smoke that goes up there. And certainly something a little bit different than what we've seen, although that has significant health impacts as well. I'm sure that both of you are seeing that up north. We've seen it down south in Calgary, east, west. It's happening quite a bit. Amy, there's been a lot of curiosity here about cultural burning from the questions that I'm seeing and being sent. And one of them, which I think would be interesting, is whether you could tell us about cultural burning, like in a specific area or a specific example or a part of Canada, and how that is used by communities as a prevention strategy. Well, and more than a prevention strategy, I should say, but.
Yeah, I can give you like a broad example. I think there's a lot of concern in communities, like I had mentioned before, about sharing like some of the knowledge and techniques around cultural fire and fear of appropriation. But I mean, probably one of the neatest things that I heard is that like, especially in the north, like in the boreal forest, what happens is if you have an open meadow or a prairie that doesn't experience fire, you'll get basically aspen, poplar that will grow, kind of sucker into that meadow and take it over. Pretty soon you'll get spruce and other things growing up. So the meadow will eventually disappear if it's just left alone. So for Indigenous people, they would go in and burn those meadows during the early spring or late fall to kind of keep the meadows open, keep the poplar and aspen from taking over. And another thing that it did was it actually in the north, where our growing season's super short, the burning of like the dry, dead brown grass would then turn the land black, which would then absorb the heat of the sun and melt the frost out of the ground sooner. So you'd get earlier grass coming up. And then at the same time, you're also reducing the amount of dry grass that's there, that's available to burn if there was like a drought or something happened. And then as well with those areas, like currently, if you have open meadows and those things that are healthy, when there is an out of control wildfire, those areas give firefighters great grounds where they can, actually try and fight and suppress a fire from, because a crown fire will drop down to a surface fire because there's obviously no big trees to burn through the crowns of. So.
Right. Interesting. It's so fascinating. I have been looking into this issue for all of about 3 weeks, so I am definitely not the expert on this panel. And it strikes me, as do a lot of topics, just how complex it is, and kind of fascinating. I've got probably time for one last question that I'll probably just direct strictly to Trina here. Someone wanted to know, how much faith, if any, do you have in the various levels of government to manage fire risk and protect us? So a bit of a subjective one there, but I mean, given what you've seen on the front lines and the cuts in Alberta, certainly, I mean, do you have much faith in governments to sort of respond to these risks?
I have faith in people. I have faith in, I think the people I met through my 7 years working in Alberta wildfire were incredible. It's really passionate people from, like I said, from all walks of life. Who, I mean, it's people who are in it. Like, I get emotional talking about it because it's like, you're part of a family, you're part of a community on the front lines, and it's really imperfect, messy work, but I think the people in the system are really working as hard as they can with the resources they have available to them. And again, sometimes it's the difficulty of voicing those things that are happening on the ground. Getting those stories out there can be challenging. And, a lot of people were concerned that such a year like this year was going to happen, and people did not feel as prepared as they've felt in previous years. And like I said, it's sad because there has been a recent precedent since 2011, and a lot of recommendations that were made that were sort of like been lost over the last years since that Slave Lake fire. And I should say too, also a lot that's been built up as well, but there have been some significant cuts. And the people I've spoken with in the early days of May said they were terribly underprepared this year for those big fires that broke out, and a really clear record that Alberta tends to get their worst fires in early May before the forest has greened up. Even if there's snow on the ground, if you get like these really hot temperatures and these wind-driven events, that's key, because a lot of these big fires are caused by huge wind events. So there's a clear precedent. Folks are frustrated, I think. But I will say I have faith in people. I think the people working on the ground are amazing. Many of them are my friends, many I don't know, but you do feel a part of it. And I think folks are really working as hard as they can. And I want to acknowledge that. I think there's a lot that we can improve on from this year. And I think I hope that we start to understand that just because a disaster doesn't happen every year, because rain is also a normal part, 2020 and 2021 and 2022 were relatively rainy years and hot years, but we didn't see the same fire activity as we saw. So we just have to remember that fire cycles, and if there are a few slow years, it doesn't mean that a big bad thing is going to happen again. And so there's a clear precedent. I have faith in the people on the ground for sure.
Well, we could talk about this all night. I have so many questions that we haven't gotten to, some my own, many from the audience. But we're coming up on the last 3 minutes here. We've got Amy and Trina still with us. John, I think, was lost to the Wi-Fi gods. But I'm going to give you each just a minute here. I mean, is there one thing, this is the wild card round, one thing that you hope people sort of take away from this conversation moving forward when they're thinking about wildfire and what's happening in Canada? Maybe we'll start with Amy and end with Trina.
Yeah, honestly, I'm tired. So it's a big one to answer. Yeah, I mean, for me, I think I saw a question about like, how can people support Indigenous folks that want to get more involved? And so I always think a good thing for allies is, that settlers and colonialism kind of created these systems and these policies and these regulations that we're living in with now that exclude Indigenous people from the land. And they were written by people, so they can also be changed and rewritten by people. So that's really where we need some advocacy there from our allies out there to help us so that we can make space for Indigenous people in fire. And yeah, just thinking about all the communities out there that are impacted, especially the one here with Little Red River, Cree Nation.
Yeah, I
Trina,
think
anything you want people to...
I think something I was chatting with a colleague recently about is that I guess what I can ask is that, I mean, inevitably, there will be some rains. These fires will get under control at some point this season, and just for wildfire to stay in people's minds. I mean, it drops from the media. We stop caring about it. We stop asking questions about it. We're not as curious to learn about it. So for wildfire to remain in people's minds, I think is really key moving forward, not just people, obviously politicians, obviously communities. We know these fires are becoming increasingly erratic. How are we going to be better prepared? I think we really need to focus on how we work with different groups, different communities to be able to prepare, to be better, to respond faster to these situations that are inevitably going to happen. So it's important, I think, wildfire stays in people's minds and people keep asking questions, even when the media stops reporting on it. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you. I'm sure John would have something brilliant to say as well, but he is not here, so we can just all imagine it. I really appreciate both of you taking the time to do this. Amy, especially given the situation that you're in and the work that you're doing, I really appreciate you finding the time to do this. This has been a great discussion. I want to thank the audience members too. Great questions that have come in. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them. Hopefully in the Q&A that I have not been monitoring, our narwhals have been helping you out back there. And I hope that you've enjoyed the conversation and that maybe some of you will join the Narwhal, sign up for a membership, join the 5,000 plus members that we already have that help us do this work. we love doing it and we want to continue to do so. And it really hinges a lot on people sort of stepping up and becoming a member. So if you like what we do, please check it out and please support us. We really, we believe that we bring something vital to this conversation, and I hope that you agree. And just a reminder, I'll do the plug one last time here. Everyone who signs up to be a member this month will get the color print issue with some of our great stories in it. So yeah, please consider it. And thank you again. Really appreciate everybody taking the time out of their days today. And I hope everybody has a good night. Thank you, Trina and Amy.